Janet is someone who started talking about neuroscience and linking it to leadership well before neuroscience became kind of like an everyday word that we all heard about. About 15 years ago, she started really studying neuroscience and linking it to leadership and organizations. So today what she does is that she consults with companies such as Wells Fargo and Yahoo and Virgin Airlines, helping them to leverage their key asset, which is their people, and utilize their knowledge and utilize the way that they structure their working environment so that it works with the brain instead of against it. And Janet is absolutely one of the most well-rounded individuals that I've ever seen or met. She's trained as a scientist. She worked for the Environmental Protection Agency for some years. I think you said you were the only woman on that team when you first started.
Yes.
She's also a professional dancer and now is a consultant and a coach. So thank you so much, Janet, for being with us.
Thank you, Karen. And before I start, I want to say thank you so much to my dear friend and colleague, Karen, and all of my new friends that I've met over the past day that are putting on this wonderful event. This is really an extraordinary event, and I think the start of something big. So I'm really delighted to be here. So as Karen mentioned, I have been interested in the brain for 15 years. Well, actually a lot longer than 15 years. And one of the things that really fascinates me about this inquiry is the degree to which our brains are really not designed for what we're doing right now. They really aren't. And we're going to explore that here today. Lest you're afraid that this is going to be a neuroscience lecture and you're going to have to remember lots of, you're going to have to go back to school and remember lots of brain parts with esoteric names. I'll mention a few, but if you forget all the names, it won't matter, because it's really the concepts that we're after here. In my own personal journey, I came from a family of scientists. My father was a well-known rocket scientist. I grew up on a research base surrounded by scientists who all thought that they were these highly logical people. And yet, as a kid, I remember looking around and saying, huh? Like, why are you doing that? That doesn't make sense. What's all this stuff? Like, how did it get here? What is it about human beings that would make a building like this or decide to make a tile or a chair that folds? Why are we like that and other animals aren't? So even though I formally started studying neuroscience 15 years ago, I think I started when I was about 4 years old, because it was always such a mystery to me how all this stuff got here. So what we're going to start with, actually, before we start there, I want to tell you a little bit more about my story and how I got into neuroscience, because I think it's germane to this group and germane to women, which is that I had a lot of inner angst. Although I was outwardly successful, and I think I share this with a lot of people, I was outwardly very successful. I struggled with depression, with obsessive compulsive disorder, with anxiety, with all sorts of things, and I was convinced that internally there was something terribly wrong with me, and that I was terribly flawed and a huge imposter, really, and that one day I was going to be found out. This is in my deep, dark hours. You know, they're going to find out, and I'm going to be the laughing stock, and no one will want to talk to me, and you know, when the story goes wild. Some recognition here. And as I started to learn about the brain, particularly the social brain, which is the new hot wave in neuroscience, is studying the social brain, I started to realize, oh, that's not me. That's the human condition. And in particular, it's the human condition in this particular moment in history. We're predisposing ourselves to feeling those kinds of things. And when you start to learn about the brain, you stop struggling with yourself quite as much. You start having some compassion not only for yourself but for other people, and the courage that it takes to live in the environment that we live in right now and to actually try to change and to try to unlearn and to try to bring those higher selves out. We're not adapted to living in the kind of world that we're living in, And when you figure out how you're really designed, it not only gives you a lot of power over yourself and directing yourself in a much more kind and compassionate way, but it gives you power in terms of your interactions with other people and compassion for them. And also a lot of forgiveness, because I can see that many of the things that I struggled with in my past or many of the missteps that I made in my life, I didn't choose. They chose me. And knowing that and knowing how I came to be the way I was then released me and freed me to create who I want to be. So we're going to talk about the brain and who you are inside all of this. And by the way, when I say the brain, I don't really mean just what's up here. I mean the distributed nervous system throughout the body. And we leave the body out of the conversation. And we leave emotions out of the conversation. This is a particular aspect of the last 500 years when we've been involved in the Industrial Revolution and the Information Revolution, where we believe that everything comes from here. And the reality is, we'll soon discover in a few moments, most of it doesn't come from here, or at least the little part that we think it's coming from. So let's take a romp back through history and talk about what human beings lived like about 70,000 or so years ago. So by the way, if we were to compress human history into the span of 24 hours, or actually 1 year, let's say 1 year. So from the beginning of the first human that we know of to today, 1 year's time, we left the African savanna about 2 to 3 days ago. So if you think about the degree to which our evolution of our human being is adapted to that environment versus how much of it has happened in the last 2 or 3 days, it's pretty extraordinary. Yeah. So that's, when you put it in that time frame, and you think about how could you possibly be adapted to what's going on right now, because the Industrial Revolution gets lost in the dust on that time frame. And the Information Revolution was like that. It's an explosion that just happened. So the brain takes many, many, many generations to adapt to something in terms of our genetic DNA. So what we're doing right now really is quite courageous, to live in an environment that we're profoundly, profoundly not designed for. So by the way, we left the savannah about 70,000 years ago. Something happened about 10,000 years ago that was extraordinary. Does anyone know what it is? Or have a guess? Agriculture. Agriculture and the domestication of animals. And it's interesting because I was cruising the web last night, and I was looking at a lot of different world philosophies, and I happened upon some stuff in fundamental Christianity, which says in many of those belief systems, that was when the story started. It was about 10,000 years ago. So it is interesting to me that that same demarcation sits there in religious history as well. So what I'd like to do with you from that standpoint, thinking about that 70,000 years ago and what we were adapted to, by the way, what we were doing then was we were living in small hunter-gatherer tribes. Anybody have a guess for what the tribe size was back then? Roughly?
10, 20, 50.
What was 50, 50-ish. Several dozen. A couple dozen to several dozen people. It would be rare to see a group go above 75 or so. And we were living in these bands of people who were born together, lived together, died together, and worked together. So going back to that time, 70,000 years ago, it was really different. I want to explore one other thing before I'm going to put you in some groups to talk about something. And I apologize for being politically incorrect here, but I think it's going to be okay. How many of you are over 25 years old? Okay. So you're old back then. How many of you are over 30 years old? Okay, on average, we're all dead. Yeah, puts a perspective on how different it is. So what I ask that you do is find a group of about 4 people and talk for just a couple minutes on what do you think life was like back then? Specifically, how do you think it was different living back then than it is now? Okay? And then we're going to come back and share a little bit about that. Of bringing women together and saying, talk amongst yourselves. So I'm interested in hearing what are some of the things in your group that you talked about that were different than what it is like to be living today. I should be over here. Sorry. All right. So what are some things that were different about that environment? Yes?
The survival issues were real. Like you could be eaten.
That's a big one. Yeah. Yes?
You interacted with fewer people and you had to work it out.
Yeah.
You had the option of moving.
Absolutely. You couldn't just get divorced and find somebody else in a new town. Right, right. Okay? Yes? The immediacy of the environment, the need to get food, to find shelter, to be able to understand the signals of what's happening around you, was real and present. So you had to be. You couldn't be racing off into the future all the time because you'd die if you did.
No, belonging.
I'm sorry?
People must have had a sense of belonging and about their role. Like if you were a child, you were a child. If you were a food getter, you were a food getter. There was just not any real.
There's no real need to figure out who am I when I grow up. You know your identity. It's set.
There also would be a need to resource every person in the community. If you had such a small community,
Yeah.
everyone would have to be respected and honored for what they did.
Absolutely. So everybody has an identity. Everybody has a role. Everybody is honored for what they do. And you can't get away with not contributing. You have to contribute. What else? What else is different? What else is different? Yes.
Life was probably felt slower because everything had to be done by hand. You couldn't jump in the car and make it to the store. Make a fire. There was probably a very...
Yeah, time is an interesting construct because there's the number of years you live, but how spacious are those years? And there's a lot of evidence that there was a tremendous amount of downtime in these societies. What other? Yes?
That there was much more of being in tune with the rhythm, the day cycles of the earth.
Right. Right. You know, you probably all heard that 8 hours of sleep is about the ideal amount of sleep. Well, the African savanna is on the equator. So that means you get 12 hours of light and 12 hours of darkness all year round, right? And it starts getting light about an hour to an hour and a half before the sun actually rises, and it gets dark about an hour to an hour and a half after the sun falls. And so our diurnal rhythms are really matched to, I want to be awake while there's still enough light out, and then I want to power down for a half hour, 45 minutes, fall asleep, and then I want to be powering up before the sun comes back up. That's how we got there, and we still carry that imprint even if we live up in Vancouver. Yeah, so back in those days, all of this is a very rich conversation. Some salient points: we spent most of our time in the sunlight. We typically walked 8 to 10 miles a day. We were born into a tribe, and we stayed in that same tribe our entire life. In other words, the need to get to know new people all the time is not present. The only way you come in or go out is you're born, you die, or you're banished. And banishment is one of the biggest fears that people have. It's actually socially imprinted on the brain. This is not something we learn. It's actually a social instinct. In fact, I'll tell you a little aside, the field of social neuroscience, which is by far the hottest field of neuroscience, absolutely dominated by women. And it's, for me, being a scientist, being one of 500 in a physics class at Cal, that's really significant. it's really wonderful to walk into a room of young women at a conference. So a young woman up at UCLA, Naomi Eisenberger, has studied social pain and determined that it's processed in the brain exactly the same as physical pain. They've also studied social exclusion and found that the brain just goes absolutely haywire in the presence of perceived exclusion, even if you don't know the people and you'll never meet them, if you think they're excluding you. So that sense of I need to belong to my tribe is really etched into us. Something that's obvious but oftentimes overlooked is we were all the same race. There were no distinctions. So if somebody came in and they looked really different from me, dead giveaway, they're not in my tribe, and what are they doing here? Right? So we actually have fear instincts, and there's a lot of social neuroscience research on race. And the unfortunate part of it is it's not really very pretty when we see what goes on in the brain when we meet people who are different from us. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't override that, but it's very useful to know that that impulse is there and naturally imprinted. It's not a character issue. But it is something that we have to be mindful of if we want to build a peaceful world together. Because the days of not having to interact between tribes are over. I mean, you only need to look around this room to know that the tribes are mixing. And they have been for a long time. So sunlight, the diet, there's not a lot of crap food back then. You can't go to 7-Eleven and, pick up a Diet Coke. Yeah, there are a few little hallucinogens here and there that you partake in rituals, but, you can't go get loaded when you feel down. So, you're going to eat wild game meat, the thing that would cost you a lot of money at Whole Foods. That's what's available to you out there. So those are the kinds of environments that our brains are actually designed around. And that's where we thrive. That's where our brain feels like if I'm getting sunlight, if I'm walking a lot, if I'm getting good food, if I'm having good sex, if I've got a partner, if I have children, if I have tight social connection with the people around me, my brain feels safe. And we're going to explore in just a minute the implications of your brain feeling safe and what happens when your brain doesn't feel safe. But is it safe to say that a lot of us are starved in some of these respects? And but I left sleep out. I mean, how many of you have ever had an issue with sleep? Yeah. So, it's different when you have a baby in a tribe and everybody in the tribe is sharing taking care of that baby. It's different when you can sleep at odd hours throughout the day because there's nothing else to do. It's a really different story when you have a baby and you're getting up all night and then you have to get up and go to work. Not designed for it. Okay. So a few other things. So these default patterns that we have were completely functional back then. We still have them. They're not so functional, many of them anymore. We didn't have the need to track detail, so our brains are actually not set up to track a lot of detail. Anybody here have to track a lot of detail? I hear people all the time say, I keep forgetting things and I don't know what's wrong with me. And it's like, well, you're human. That's what's wrong with you. And by and large, your learning lasted more or less a lifetime. Those oral stories were stable over many, many generations. When you learned something, the need to let it go wasn't all that frequent. So the challenge that we're up against in saying, I have a pattern and I need to let go of it, it takes a lot of courage and actually setting yourself up for success in terms of keeping your brain functional in order to do that. So let's take a look at where behavior comes from. Like, why do we do the things that we do? So I'm going to separate the room roughly into, do you mind being our prefrontal cortex? Sure. Okay, so Karen, you're gonna pull your chair back here a little bit. And then everybody over to, we'll just say over to this group right here. You can stay seated. Okay. So this group right here, you're learned programming. Yes, you're the stuff that the brain learned after birth. And everybody else over here, you guys are all instinct. Okay? So if you think about it in those terms, when you move through your day,
We're banishing the...
yeah. So when you move through your day, by the way, all this stuff is unconscious. The only place that actually has any conscious volition or awareness of what it's, the shots it's calling, Karen. Woohoo! At least we have a good one in charge, you know. But suffice it to say that that's about the balance in your brain. This is about the part of the brain that consciously calls the shots, and this is everything that keeps it humming in the background. So most of your brain, got a nice little brain up here. It doesn't look like most of the brain, but this outer layer up here, that's the neocortex, or the new shell of the brain. That's what differentiates us from other animals. It's the part of the brain that can think volitionally, consciously, has will, can think into the future. No other animal can think into the future in the way that we do, which allows us to think of things like this and say, it would be nice to have a structure. Let's, through the power of language, communicate and make it happen. That's why other animals don't build this stuff. I mean, in part, it's because we have hands, but that's a reciprocal process. So that outer neocortex, believe it or not, is only 6 cell layers deep. The reason it looks so big is it's invaginated. Invagination in scientific language is it's folded in on itself. So if you were to spread it out, it would be about the size of a football field. But it's this thin little layer that's all crunched up together. Underneath that, everything underneath that top kind of gray level is called the subcortical regions. And that's where all of this learned programming and instinct resides. But it's the old part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that evolved to keep animals alive. And so that's mostly what's going on. So when you feel excluded and you react to it, this part of the brain isn't what's going, oh my God, I'm being excluded. This part of the brain's going, oh, I'm getting a signal that I'm being excluded. What should I do about it? Actually, though, most of what you do about it is over here, the learned programming. So you just react. Has anybody just ever reacted to something without thinking? So every single one of those patterns that you brought up about letting go of, none of them reside here. They're all in here. Let's talk about instinct for a second. What do you think some of your instinctual behaviors are? I've already mentioned a few of them, but yeah, hunger is an instinct. Sex.
Protection.
Protecting oneself. Protecting young. So literally infolding behaviors, bodily behaviors, instinctual. Most of our bodily reactions to things are either learned or instinctual. Bright, shiny objects.
What?
Bright, shiny objects.
Bright, shiny objects are instinctual.
Instinctual. So if something shines or glitters or moves fast, it's probably... Yeah, we want it. No, it's probably food or predator or prey. So loud noises means something has suddenly shifted in our environment, and we better pay attention to it because there could possibly be danger there. So all of this stuff, our brain just naturally pays attention to. Has anybody tried to, say, write an article, and you keep checking your email because it starts bouncing up and down? Turn the damn thing off. Because your brain is actually trained. You can't not look at it. It's bouncing. And if you start paying attention to the internet, it's all over the place on the internet in terms of the internet. Yeah. By the way, it's instinctual to want to know what the end of the story is. So when you log on in the morning and you get that home page and there's this story and it says click through, and then 3 hours later you're still clicking through. Yeah. So suffice it to say that we have a lot of instincts that they serve us well most of the time. And a lot of times in today's environment, they don't so well. Now, somebody said something early on that was key, which is that, and I don't remember who said it, survival issues were real back then. Yeah. That the likelihood was that you were going to die before the age of 30. Something was going to eat you. You were going to fall off of a cliff. Something dramatically bad was going to happen. A lot of people died by the way of toothaches. Because if you don't treat an abscess, it goes into a brain infection and you die. And if you're eating a lot of raw meat and you don't have a lot of ways to clean it out, you get little bits of grit in there and you get tooth abscesses and you die. So a lot of the things that we didn't die of cancer back then because, first of all, there wasn't a lot of crap food to eat and a lot of toxins in the environment, but we didn't live long enough, actually, to die of cancer. There's a whole set of social triggers for the brain that you instinctually pay attention to, and if these things aren't happening well in your environment, it sends the brain into fear. So fairness. By the way, remember, these are instincts. This is not your psychology calling the shot. So fairness, lack of choice, uncertainty, difference, status. We as social animals it's ingrained to want to know what our status is. And if somebody does something that lessens our status, it sends the brain into fear mode. So all of these things are biologically related, and you will react to them if you sense them in your environment. Yes?
Did you say all of those trigger fear?
All of those trigger fear if they're not taken care of. If you assess that you're not being treated fairly, but think about it. If you're in a tribe and there's only 50 people there, and you're not getting treated, you're not getting treated fairly, or people are putting your status down and saying you don't have an identity here, it's threatening. And by the way, I should say this goes both directions. If you have too much choice, it's also a brain threat. So people that aren't used to the level of choice that we have in this culture, we think, oh, it's great, we can buy anything, and they'll go into Safeway, and it's like, just give me one kind of cola, No, lack of choice means if I don't have any way to influence the situation, it's inherently dangerous. So it doesn't mean that I have the kind of choices that I might have, like, do I want to be a doctor, or do I want to be a, school teacher? It's the kind of choice of, do I have the ability to influence the outcome here? Okay, so these are all social instincts. Now let's talk a little bit about this next group, learned programming. So we learn all the time. We have lots of habits, right? But these fundamental identity patterns, those ones at the bottom of the iceberg, anybody have an inkling of how you get them? Attachment, childhood, imprinting. Yeah. So you get these, by and large, before the age of 2. Almost all of your fundamental identity patterns you got before the age of 2. And there's something really significant that happens at 2 years old. Around there, starts about 18 months. You start to develop your hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that has conscious memory and autobiographical memory. So you develop all of these patterns before you even know that you have them or can remember them. So they have the feeling of being the way the world is. So this happens to all of us. We run into a situation and we know what's happening in that situation. We know that that person's trying to take advantage of us, or we know that we're being excluded. I mean, I'll give a personal one of mine. I get a lot of positive feedback from people, and my immediate default is, well, they're just saying that to be nice. And I can logically think of all of the, but there's no reason for them to do that, and I can make a case for it's actually accurate, but there's a part of my brain that goes, nobody says things like that other than to be nice. I didn't get that. That's not an instinct, by the way. We're not imprinted to think that way. But where did I get that from? It's always been there. And so we all have those patterns and those interpretations of the world that have always been there for us. We get them through skin contact, somatic skin contact with our parents. which is something that I left out about those primitive environments. We were touching each other all the time. We were touching each other more than we weren't touching each other, unless we were engaged in an activity that required that we not touch. So this is another place where we're chronically deprived in this culture, is around touch. So these patterns you get from principally your mother or anybody who's holding you and taking care of you as an infant. And quite literally what's happening is that your body is, and your sensory apparatus is picking up everything that's going on in an implicit way, not in conscious memory, but in an implicit way, and saying, in these kinds of conditions, the way to feel about it is this, because your body is going to copy the physiology of your mother, and then imprint that, whenever I get in this situation, produce this physiology, and physiology actually drives our interpretation of the world. We also come to love the people who have those patterns. This is why many of us are in relationships over and over again with the same person who looks really different each time. Because as a child, you are absolutely 100% helpless. We're one of the few animals that's born with an 18-year trajectory, or actually 21-year trajectory to maturity. Male brains actually develop slower than female brains. They develop fully about 21, female it's 17 to 18. But we're completely dependent on our parent, and so we bond very closely with our parent and produce a lot of oxytocin and other very powerful chemicals in the presence of those patterns. And so we encounter them later in life, and what does our body do? Wow! The logical mind can go, this is a bad situation, I should run away. And the body goes, yeah, man, I found my match. And usually it's the body that wins in that conversation. Given that this is what's going on, that you have all of these patterns that are operating in the background, and by the way, if you go back 70,000 years ago, these patterns weren't that different from person to person, because the patterns get generated out of the environment. And if the environment is stable, and the tribe is stable, and the belief systems of the tribe are stable, pretty much everybody gets the same kind of patterns with little variations. Now we're in a society where people have enormous differences in patterns. And so we have lots of clashes of the world. You know, my world doesn't match your world. So let's talk a little bit about, so how does this work when you try to change things? Now, I think to do that initially, what I'm going to do is a quick demo. I'm going to need a couple of volunteers. So I need 2 volunteers to stand on either side of this chair, just to the back of it. And by the way, this is really easy. Easy and quick. Thank you. So this is our neocortex up here. This is this recently evolved part of the brain. And we have, let's see if I can reverse this. This is my right hand. So this is your left. I'm right-left dyslexic, so reversing things for an audience is really challenging. So you're left, right? And you're right. So this is the left and right brain. And most of you have probably heard a lot about, you know, what the left brain does and the right brain. A lot of it is not accurate, actually. So one thing that you can say is that the left brain is more logical, language, linear-oriented. And it's easy to remember because they all start with L. And the right likes to do connections of logically unconnected things, which is why it gets called creative. But they have reciprocal interaction all the time. It's not as separate as you might read in a lot of the literature, pop literature. So I need somebody to connect these 2 lovely ladies up, like maybe link arms or something. Thank you, Kavita. So Kavita's our nerve central. She's our corpus callosum, which is a part of the brain that runs right down the center and connects up the different hemispheres of the brain. Now we have a happy neocortex because it can think logically and
They're being
a really happy neocortex. This is the part of the brain that thinks into the future and imagines things that aren't here now. It will go into some specialized functions that are really important in just a moment. This is the part of the brain that can actually overcome instinct if it wants to. It can choose a different pathway. This is where consciousness or conscious volition resides. But now we're going to get into those murkier regions, the subcortical regions. So I need somebody to sit in the chair. So Darcy is our limbic system. Now there's lots of other subcortical parts that I'm not going to go into right now. The limbic system is the emotional seat of the brain. And that's the part of the brain that helps you bond with other people. It's the part of the brain that sorts and stores a lot of these patterns. And it's also the part of the brain that does most of the decision making. So when you think about emotions, emotions are powerful motivators, right? If you don't have an emotion, you're not probably going to do much. So if your emotions aren't aligned with what it is that you want to do, you're going to have a real difficult time doing it. In fact, the Latin roots of emotion is that which moves us to action. And if you think about it, like sadness predisposes certain kinds of action, happiness predisposes that, excitement, will send you down different pathways. And if you damage this part of the brain and you send somebody to that Safeway with all the choices, they'll be there all day and come home with an empty cart because they can't choose. You choose based on getting a feeling of this is right. So we dismiss this part of the brain, but actually this is really the part that's calling the shots, and then the logical brain goes, let me think of a reason why that was good. So we have one last part, somebody who's willing to sit on the floor. Thank you. And remind me your name. Grucha. Grucha is our reptilian brain. So the reptilian brain is the most ancient part of the brain. And by the way, you're not touching yet. So the reptilian brain is what carries the most basic instinctual information, the survival-based information in the brain. Now, when things are going really well, this part of the brain is really powerful. This part of the brain can get lots done, has incredible control over the environment. When things aren't going so well, when fear comes into the picture, the brain goes, you know, this is not the time to innovate. It's really not. This is not the time to change the tried and true, because when you do, you really don't know what the ripple effect of that is going to be. And by the way, those deep-seated patterns that I have, those kept my mom alive long enough to pass her DNA on, so they must be pretty darn good. So the brain, when things aren't going so well, will start to fight like hell for those patterns. So let's imagine that in one of your boots, you have something called the amygdala. And the amygdala is the center of the brain that actually, it's got a bad rep because people always call it the fear center, but it's actually the center of the brain that just measures emotional valence of the environment. But in particular, if it senses that there's enough in the environment that we should be anxious about, it kind of wakes the reptilian brain up. Exactly. They're very nice. I was going to tell you to do that, but you're one step ahead of me. And now Rucha is in control of the brain, and generally what you're going to do is send some signals up that's going to cause Kavita to kind of drop her connections and freeze up. So you're not happy brain anymore. So one thing I forgot to do is have Kavita connect in with the limbic brain. So the real happy brain would have been when they're all connected up. But when the reptilian brain comes into the picture, these guys all kind of shrink to their corners. And that allows the instincts to take over. And the more you're in fear, the more instinctual-based your behaviors will be. But suffice it to say that all those nasty habits that we have are the things that we're wanting to change. By the way, the vast majority of your patterns and habits are highly functional. But we only see the ones that are getting in our way are the ones that pop to visibility. So when we're in that anxiety mode, the reptile takes over. And when it's bad enough, what we do is fight, flight, and freeze, which is a really useful response in the jungle, right? Or in the savannah. If you're being chased by a tiger, run. If you see the tiger in the tree and you can't outrun it, freeze. It might not see you. So those are really useful in the savannah. It's not so useful when you're sitting in a meeting and somebody says something snide or says something about a meeting that you weren't included in, and your brain goes, fear, 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 I wasn't included, and all of a sudden you start to shut down, and then you say something nasty that you regret later. That's what's called an amygdala hijack. Literally, in the neuroscience literature, it's an amygdala hijack. So you guys can sit down. Thank you. Huh? Okay. So I'm going to do a quick exercise with all of you. I've just been given the 15-minute time check, so we're going to speed this up. There's part of the brain called the basal ganglia. It stores patterns. You've got the prefrontal cortex. Here's what the prefrontal cortex does. This is up in that logical brain part. So the prefrontal cortex takes care of emotional balance, attuned communication, impulse control, fear moderation, empathy, strategic thought, intuition, and morality. You kind of like to have that in good shape, right? What do you think keeps it in good shape?
Love.
Sleep, love, sunlight, good sex, low stress, good food, touching. Guess what? All the stuff that we had by default on the savannah is what keeps this in good shape. So we're in a bit of a pickle, right? Literally what happens is, Karen, you want to get up and be our prefrontal cortex? So Karen's our prefrontal cortex, and we're going to decide, Kavita, you're a pattern that she wants to moderate. Would you mind being a pattern? Okay. So if we're in good shape, if you would join, Peggy. So now the prefrontal cortex has got that pattern outnumbered. And it can activate that impulse control. It can say, don't do that. I've decided it's not a good idea. So the prefrontal cortex, when it's in good shape and that tries to take on an average kind of habitual pattern, can generally do pretty well. But usually only if it's focusing on one. But now, let's see, the baby won't stop crying. What side are you on? Get up. Your check didn't show up on time. You took up meditation. Your coworker got a bigger bonus than you did. I wasn't paying attention. You're spending time in nature. You didn't get included in the invite. Your car is making funny noises. You woke up with a toothache. That's big. That's really bad news on the savannah. But Karen, you got some good sleep last night.
Oh, thank you.
And somebody forwarded you an inspiring video on YouTube. And Lorraine, your partner did something that shows that they listen to you.
Oh.
And let's see, a complete stranger said something kind to you. A complete stranger said something kind to you. And somebody that you needed to call you didn't. So, see how it goes? When this side has got resources, it can activate fear moderation and impulse control. It can say, I know that you feel anxious about that, but it's not real and it's okay to change. But when this side, you didn't get a good night's sleep. You tried to take up meditation, but you dropped it after a day. You live next to the park and you keep meaning to get out and take a walk. Somebody forwarded you that video and you said, I'll get to it one of these days.
Sounds familiar.
And these two are dependent on something external. And the point of that is we all have a part in helping other people change. Because when we help decrease their fear, we help them be able to step into their higher selves. Now, something else that I will say about this is that there is a concept of limbic resonance, that all of us are emotionally resonating with each other. This is not funny kind of hokey science. This is real science. That the mere presence of another person causes your body and your emotional state to shift. We have a whole mechanism in our brain that is, and by the way, you can go sit down, so we've got, I'm realizing we're excluding some people back here. So we have this mechanism for attuning to other people, and actually, when we hang out with people who are really functional and have the abilities and patterns that we want to have, our brain will naturally repattern after them. Now, I wanted to say a couple of things. It does, but I'm not going to go there. Not as powerfully, but it does. So obviously, one of the things that you can do to change is to take really good care of yourself. It's vitally important. It's not just being indulgent. And the problem with women is if you go out to the savannah, the logic, the calculus is if I'm taking care of the kids and staying close in and hunting and gathering, while they're out hunting, they're taking the big time risks. If I delay my needs and take care of them because there's more immediate risk for them, they'll turn around and bring me meat. Doesn't work in the workplace because men relate to women in the workplace as other men. If you needed it, you would have asked for it. So men have a natural it's not wrong, it's actually great. They have a natural biological impulse to keep a reserve. And in fact, it's been studied over and over that actually great female scientist out of Yale, Amy Arnsten, who calls the prefrontal cortex the Goldilocks of the brain, has studied something called the inverted U, which says that women, on average, tend to run at optimal rev speed. That means if we can add another thing in, we will. And men tend to operate just on this side of the curve. So when the going gets tough, if you're a male manager managing males and you push them and you inject a little bit of fear, they'll actually do better. You inject fear for women and they drop off the other edge. They start to lose functionality because they go into fear because they don't have any reserve to fight it. So the strategy for managing women under stress is very different. If you add comforting things and you subtract fear, they do better. And men, on average, if you add a little bit in there, they do better. So we're very different in that regard. So that's one way that women are different from men. And it's something that's very, very significant because if you think about the importance of taking care of your prefrontal cortex and all the things that it does for you, and the natural impulse that's not getting fed anymore in this environment that says take care of other people first before you take care of yourself is a losing equation. Because if you follow your natural instinct, you will always put it off till tomorrow. Has anybody put it off till tomorrow? Yeah. So that's one of the things that you can do. The other thing that you can do to really leverage your brain is to engage in activities that help you recognize your patterns. Now, the interesting thing about patterns is that the logical brain is really bad at recognizing them because they are, in fact, the filter through which the logical brain has gotten its information. So for the logical brain, it is what is. So we tend to see patterns in what kinds of ways? Where do they show up for us? Like, how do we discover our own patterns? That's actually a question for you. Sometimes under stress, they show up because they get in our way. Reflection is a big one. So journaling, meditation is a really big one because meditation is all about centering in the here and now. And the patterns are going to take you out of the here and now. But sometimes there is a part of the brain that kind of sits above in a neutral observer position. And that part of the brain is strengthened very heavily by meditation. And it allows you to kind of sit above and have a neutral stance on things. So that's one way you discover them. Yes?
People tell us our partners.
I was waiting for that. Sometimes in a kind way, sometimes in not a kind way, but interaction with other people is where oftentimes our patterns will surface, which is why I think conversations like this are so vitally important, to create a safe space where we can see ourselves.
We also tend to be annoyed in other people at things that we actually don't like about ourselves.
Yeah.
Being more conscious of what it is that is annoying.
Yeah. And I could go into the neurology of that, but it's a neurological fact that intentionally you will notice the things that you actually have a template for. So in terms of, I think I will close here, in terms of overcoming a pattern, there's really two things that I would leave you with. One has everything to do with Judy's work, which is these patterns don't just exist in our brain. They exist in our body. So we run a template, we run a pattern through our bodies. And if you disrupt the body, if you disrupt the physiology, you disrupt the pattern. So becoming aware of the habitual ways in which you hold yourself and expanding your repertoire and being able to notice in the moment that I'm holding myself in a particular way and change to a different or more expansive place is a very direct pattern interrupt. The other thing that I'll mention is, can I have 5 people lined up in the front? Here's what happens in terms of activating your patterns. All the information comes in through your senses. You process it. That takes about 0.3 seconds. So right here, impulse comes in. You go, here's what I'm going to do. And then there's about a 0.2 second delay. So let's separate you guys out a little bit. There's about a 0.2 second delay before you actually do it. Not very long. So it's very important that you know how to recognize your pattern, because you don't have time to think it over. And you also don't have time to think of what you want to do instead. So you better know what the pattern is and what it is that you want to be doing instead. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this has also been studied scientifically, and people, when they become good at recognizing either their patterns or their emotional state, it shifts. So Shalini, you're going to join this group. You generate the impulse faster, and you have more time to reconsider it. So it may not seem like much, one person, but it's actually a 50% increase in the amount of time that you have to override the pattern. It's pretty significant. Yeah, so let's say I'm on a technical support call with an unnamed printer company. Totally hypothetically. And I suddenly have an impulse to say something sarcastic to the person I'm talking to. This is a pattern I have. And I knew that pattern. I know that it's something that I want to break, because I get off the phone and I think that actually didn't accomplish anything in terms of spreading goodwill in the world, in terms of having them change their product service mode. It didn't accomplish anything, but it got me all worked up and upset. And so I was able to go, that's the pattern, and then I already had something in mind. Take a sip of water, breathe. Think about what somebody that I really respect would think if they were watching me right now. And I said that. So there's many ways that I can use, little tools that I can use to interrupt myself in that moment and motivate myself to do something else. Now, the key is, during that moment, the primitive brain is going crazy. It's going, no, 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 you want to do that old pattern. Really seriously, you do. So you have to be ready to feel that sense of discomfort and do the other thing anyway, because doing that in repetition is going to start to teach the brain that, oh, this new pattern is okay too. And in fact, it's working better, so given the choice, I'll take it. But you have to overcome that initial phase of the brain trying to fight you on it. And just know that it will feel uncomfortable, and that's natural.
Janet, is that what they mean in meditation when they say, like, sit with the discomfort? Like, that's the whole, you have to, that's that exact space.
And that is one of the reasons that meditation is so powerful, because if you train yourself to be able to sit with discomfort when it comes up, when you're trying to override something that you're familiar with it, it's not as fearful. It's like, oh, I know what this is, and it doesn't kill me. It's okay. I can sit with it, quite literally. So I think I'm going to end there. I'm probably just about at time. Thank you.
And we're not really just being nice. You can say we're sarcastic.
Funny thing, I actually didn't have that reaction.
Yay! Thank you for that very, very rich, content-rich, and very provocative discussion, Janet.